Okay, so I'm listening to Sam Harris talking about, uh, well, I get the actual clip is called Milo Yiannopoulos Deconstructed by Sam Harris. Now, generally speaking, I mean, I listen to Sam, he makes some interesting points. But at the moment, the point that I want to push back on, and I guess this is really specific, he's talking about, I guess, identity politics to some degree, and okay, this is okay. So the point he's trying to make, if I understand him correctly, is that you can't base your an argument um, or to use your identity as some form of, if I say, validity for your argument is insufficient. Now, yes, I mean, yes, of course, that I agree with. I mean, but I think he takes that point maybe a step too far by saying that it should have no bearing on the argument that you're making. And what I want to push back and so a couple examples he used. One example was parents of autistic kids, and just this past summer, there's a lot of controversy around autism, and there was a documentary I think earlier in the year that was initially supposed to be aired during Robert De Niro's festival in New York, and was, I think, last minute was pulled because of all the controversy of this particular documentary that I've since heard is a really really good documentary. I myself haven't seen it, but in any case, there's a lot of controversy sort of swimming around, uh, you know, um, this controversy, but specifically this topic around whether or not vaccines contribute to autism. And so Sam's point is that your arguments have to be independent of your identity. So, for instance, to start your argument with something like, as the parent of an autistic child, that really doesn't bolster, your position. And then I think the next statement, or the next sort of area that he used as an example was, sort of looking at, police violence against minorities, and again saying that as a minority, that's not really your claim to legitimacy insofar as making your point is concerned. Okay, so here's my thing. here's, here's my thing. Here's my pushback. Um, I do agree. I'm somebody who, I think of myself anyways as somebody who's fairly fact oriented, right? I want to know the facts as they stand, and to argue based on those facts. Um, and the facts should bear out independent of identity. They should. But I think in reality, we all recognize that identity politics isn't simply a figment of people's imaginations. And what I mean by that is that there are a series of actions, um, transgressions, violations that occur specifically based on your identity. So it almost stands to reason that your identity is a legitimate part of your argument. Because if you are somebody who is not of that identity, that condition, that circumstance, that reality simply does not apply to you. So, I'm not really sure that I quite buy that there is sort of no grounds for how your identity contributes to the veracity of a particular argument. I think facts absolutely bear out, but I don't think that facts are necessarily independent of identity. I think sometimes circumstances are completely dependent on what a person's identity is, and insofar as they're even a criteria for a particular set of circumstances. So now, should that matter with respect to presenting the case or presenting the argument itself? So, for instance, um, is it more meaningful for the argument to come from a black, like, so if we're talking about something that's you know racially motivated or some sort of racial circumstance or situation, does it matter more if a black person presents the argument than if a white person does? Um, it should just be fact oriented. On the face of it, obviously, yes, it should just be fact oriented. But the reality of human beings and human sort of conditions is that human beings respond to and react to. So, for instance, a white person saying a set of circumstances or situations is going to be received in a particular way versus if a black person says it, right? There's a set of criteria. I mean, is that what you should base the argument on? Of course not. You should base it on the facts. What is the white person saying versus what is the black person saying? But it actually has been proven out many times that even if they were saying the same things, so if the white person is saying the same thing as the black person, oftentimes the white person is believed and the black person is not, right? So I'm not saying that that makes the white person a better debater or that they're presenting sounder arguments, but our interpretation of the facts somehow become filtered through our perception of the person who's presenting the facts. So that's a form of identity politics that's implicit in our comprehension or in our ability to sort of ascribe any sort of discernment to an argument, right? And likewise, from the point of view of the person presenting the argument, does it matter if you're black or if you're white? I think it does. Should it? No. But does it? Yeah. Because if you're black, you may see things differently, experience things differently, have a different, tolerance for things. And likewise, if you're white, you'll see things differently, experience things differently, have a different tolerance for circumstances and situations. So, do I think that your identity should form the crux of your argument? Obviously not. But do I think that it lends a particular bend or perspective or weight or does it filter through some sort of lens that may challenge the debate, or it may lend veracity to it? I think absolutely. I don't think that we can completely act as though identity is not part and sort of part of how we interpret facts. I mean, I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that day to day, whether we're reading a news article or juries are debating over the guilt or innocence of somebody who's being accused of something, identity plays into all of that. So for better or for worse. So I mean, and again, on the face of it, I completely agree with this idea that it should be independent of all of that, but that the facts should just bear out on their own. But I think sometimes that's naive, right? Because I think sometimes, like I say, identity is the reason why circumstances are what they are. So, for instance, factually speaking, you could very easily say that, let's say we're talking about something like Black Lives Matter, which, again, I've heard criticism of the movement in many ways, and some of it sounds fair, and some of it just sounds like propaganda. But, just looking at something like that, and the sort of the framework for what brought about this movement in the first place. The movement comes about from a climate that exists. That climate doesn't exist in every area. That climate exists in very specific regions. So, so the existence of that climate is dependent on identity, right? It doesn't exist separate from identity. Because if you remove the identity, you probably remove the climate, right? How do we bear that out in terms of facts? Well, you need research, you need numbers, you need all of these things. Short of that, what we've had for generations are simply anecdotes and stories of people talking about the relationship between the police and the Black communities. That said, that hasn't really brought about a ton of change or even really a ton of criticism. It wasn't until some of these incidences were quote unquote caught on tape, right? And then that started to raise some eyebrows and started to raise some concerns and some worries about what policing uh, what is actually happening in these instances, and how can these situations be better managed, right? So was that separate and apart from identity? Um, because these facts have been around for a really, really long time, but these facts weren't addressed or necessarily believed to any great degree until we had some sort of objective filming of the situation in order to lend some weight to these instances. So, you know, yeah, I don't think it's that simple. I mean, I think we all want to believe in the facts. We all want to believe that we are, not biased, and that we won't simply shrug something off or dismiss things outright. But I think actually people do that quite a bit. And I don't, uh, I think people rely quite heavily on their own, belief systems and biases and stuff in order to arrive at what what I think generally what people want to do is they want to arrive at the truth that they are most comfortable with. So um, I don't know what. Oftentimes that doesn't have very much to do with facts. Now that said, you could use facts to support the truth you're most comfortable with. So what I mean by that is, again, looking at something like Black Lives Matters, is you could pick a region in the United States, right? And so let's say the argument is, oh well, cops are violent with you know um, uh, perpetrators, right? Pick a place in the United States where that doesn't happen very much, right? And the facts would bear out that argument is inaccurate. It's false, right? That's a factual statement for that particular region or for that particular group, right? Um, and and you wouldn't really need to argue with those facts, because in that particular instance, it's absolutely true. They're not violent in that area with that group. Um, and again, I say, people have been saying that this kind of tension has existed for generations, but that was largely, dismissed, right? That was largely treated as, I don't know, folklore or something, until we had, these recorded instances where you could actually have public discourse and public conversation in and around, police treatment of certain racial groups. And so that's something, that's something. I don't think so, and even with that, I completely agree with the idea of looking at the situation for what it is. This isn't about bandwagoning. This isn't about, light up the streets. It's really about looking at legitimately what is going on and how do we fix it. What is the problem? How do we get at that problem so this kind of thing doesn't happen again? And I think that every instance where a life is unnecessarily lost should be treated with that level of severity. Every time, every time, every time. If it's a legitimate reason, if it's a legitimate cause, that's fine. But that should bear out with that part of that, this, responsibility of authority, right? That is that authority can withstand the scrutiny, right? So if you're in the right, you're in the right, and granted, these are difficult jobs. Everybody, I think, to my understanding, the way that I grew up, everybody respects police officers and all of these things and understands that they have difficult work to do. But the only way that I think this whole infrastructure maintains its integrity is to, in fact, demonstrate its integrity, right? And part of that is to be able to withstand scrutiny, and to be able to answer for any types of indiscretions or violations, even if they're perceived, right? To be able to go through the process of, whatever oversight is needed in order to arrive at the reasons as to why something that shouldn't have happened did happen, and to figure out how we can prevent that from happening again. I don't think that that's unreasonable where a life is concerned. Loss of life should be grievous every time, every time, every time. Doesn't matter who the loss of life is. In these instances, in these particular instances where you see people losing lives, they're not losing lives because, I mean, I'm sure that there are instances where people lose lives because maybe they did confront the police officer, and these sorts of things happen. Fine. But in the instances where it is apparent that these people did not, they weren't challenging the officers, they weren't really doing anything but just sort of standing there. They weren't being threatening, and then nothing threatening was happening and people lost their lives. That's unacceptable. I don't really care who you are. I think any reasonable thinking, feeling person looking at a situation like that can accept that as an unreasonable, that's just unreasonable. And that should not be something that, as a citizen of a quote-unquote free country, that should not be something that you should come to expect from police officers in terms of when they come on the scene, what could happen. Well, what should happen is that you should feel safe, not like you should feel threatened, right? And in these instances, when things like this, whether they're accidents or even if the police officer was doing the right thing or doing his job or whatever, as I say, loss of life should be treated with a certain level of seriousness, so as to ensure, it reassures the community that they can have faith and confidence when police officers show up to a scene. They can feel good about that and not tense up and not feel like they have to run, not feel like their lives are threatened. It's about protecting the integrity, not just, I think, of the force, but the integrity of the society that we're trying to cultivate, right? But again, identity politics, I think, is a huge part of what we think of as acceptable and unacceptable. Your identity plays into this stuff. I don't think it stands separate and apart from it. I'm not saying it plays into it every time, but I'm saying it plays into it often enough that I think it's a legitimate position to have, because it gives you a particular perspective where an argument is concerned. So, for instance, in Sam's case, when he was talking about the parents of an autistic child, right? Personally, I would see that as, is it anecdotal? Sure. But also, it's up close and personal. A parent can say, my child looked like this and acted like this and this and this before they had this, shot or took this needle, and then they looked like this and acted like this afterwards. I noticed a marked difference in my child as a result of this. Is it anecdotal? Absolutely. But is it relevant that they are parents of some, I think it's relevant. I think it's relevant and it's meaningful because it is happening to them, right? Likewise, in the Black Lives Matter thing, it's relevant because it's happening to this group. Without the identity, the situation doesn't have resonance. It doesn't have relevance, right? So I think that's maybe not, as I say, maybe not the crux of your argument. Certainly not the thing that's going to form the foundation of the facts that you're trying to present. But it helps to frame and position an argument in such a way that it has maybe emotional resonance or a type of conditional legitimacy. So it might not be legitimate in all cases, but it's legitimate in this case for this particular reason that it happens to be based on identity. So does it play a part? I think it does. I think it does. Do we want it to? Maybe we don't. But at the end of the day, the reality is the society we live in, identity plays a huge part.